Welcome to the 8th lesson of our EDU Onyx series on learning Python. Today we will discuss creating your own functions for use in Python programs. We've looked at the basics of using functions multiple times within our Python programs that we've written so far. Built-in functions, like the print function, are useful to us when we want to perform actions in our program. But in addition to using built-in functions for your programs, you can also create your own functions to extend your program's functionality. Like we've discussed earlier, functions are simply pre-constructed sets of instructions for your program to follow. They can be very useful for performing tasks more than once in your Python program, like repeating the same calculation a few different times with some different variables, and can be used to simplify complex tasks in this way. All functions you will write in Python will begin with the def keyword. Def is short for the word define, and lets Python know we want to define a function's instructions here. Then, we'll add a set of parentheses, in which you would generally place any parameters you want the function to work with. But we won't work with any parameters quite yet, so for now you can leave this blank when defining functions in the next two examples. Then, you'll need to add a colon to tell Python that you are defining the function's instructions there. When we start defining functions in Python, we'll start to work with a very important concept within the Python programming language that can cause many issues for you if you aren't careful. It'll be very important for you to place tab indentation after the colon in your function's definition statement to let Python know that all the statements that are indented with this tab are part of the function definition. Python uses this tab indentation to let it know when there is a differentiation in scope, which we'll talk about later. So let's look at some simple uses for a function and write a simple example where we can use a function to look at how they work a little more closely. So first, let's create a simple variable that we might want to perform some calculations with. We can just call it x in this instance. Let's give x a basic value and then create a function to perform some calculations with x. So first, let's write our function, starting with the define keyword, which is shortened to def, our function name. Make sure we have our parentheses, but let's not put anything in them quite yet. And then the colon, to let Python know we're going to start defining some function instructions here. When we press enter in idle, it will automatically wrap around to the next line and indent, so as to let Python know this is where our function instruction statements are. From here, let's do a simple calculation and print out the results, all in one line. For example, let's print out x divided by 10. And that's all there is to it. Now when we write our regular code, let's first make sure to backspace so Python knows we're not writing code into the function anymore. And then let's change the x value and call our function a few times so we can see how functions can be useful for performing repeat calculations. You'll need the parentheses when calling your function in the Python code. Let's change the value twice and call the function each time so we can see what the results of our calculation are. Then let's save and run our program so we can see exactly what happens. The results are printed out to the console window. Each time we wanted to perform a calculation involving our x variable, instead of having to rewrite another print and division statement like we might have had to without functions, we were able to write the operation once and then simply each time we changed our variable, call the function again to re-perform the same calculation. This is one of the many benefits of writing functions within the Python programming language. Now that we've looked at the basics of defining functions in Python, we need to look at creating our own parameters for our functions. We've talked before about how you can pass functions data with parameters. For example, if you were to write a function that performs calculations, you might need parameters for your function to take as input the data you want to perform calculations with. In the parentheses of our function definition statement, we can declare some variables that we want our function to work with. These variables that we declare in our function's definition statement are known as the function's parameters. When our function is called, values need to be placed in the parameter variables, and then our function can work with the provided values. This allows you to add many different kinds of functionality to your programs by allowing you to perform the same action multiple times with different data, similar to what you did earlier with the calculate function that we just wrote. To get a closer look at parameters, let's write a simple function that calculates the area of a triangle and call it a few times with some different parameters to see how we can do this in Python. So first, we're going to need another function definition statement. But this time, in the parentheses, we're going to need some parameters. We're going to want the user to be able to input the base and height of a triangle, since those are the two things we'll need for the formula. So let's create a variable named base, and then a variable named height. Since we're defining variables in the parameter section of our function, they will be passed values, and therefore we don't need to give them values already. When the user calls the function, they will need to input the values. Then let's add our colon again and start defining this function's instructions. So first, we'll create a variable for the area, which is what our function will return to the user. And set it equal to the formula for the area. In this case, that's base times height divided by 2. Make sure to use parentheses so that Python knows which calculations to perform in which order. And then let's use a return statement to return that value to the user. Basically, all this does is when the function is finished running, it will output the value that is next to our return statement. And that's all we really need to do to define this function. So now, let's write a few calls to it to see how it runs. So first, let's write a call to the triangle area function. And then let's place in some values for the parameters. For example, here we'll use 15 and 4 for base and height. And then make sure that we print out the result, since it's being returned to the Python program. We can use a few more calls to this function to demonstrate how parameters work. You can place in any values for base and height, and Python will return to you the appropriate calculation. Now we can save and run our program again and see the results of our calculations. Each call to the triangle area function ran a different calculation and printed out to us the result of that calculation. Functions with parameters can be run as many times as needed within your program with different values so as to perform the same calculation for different purposes over and over and over again. When you create parameters and variables within your functions, it is important to remember that those functions, variables, and parameters only exist within that function. In programming, we say that variables within a function's definition only exist within the scope of your function, basically meaning that only within that section of code, unless certain other declarations are made, which we'll look at later, do these variables exist. Scope is very important to remember when programming. Take a look at the following piece of code. While it might appear that it might print out 22 because we've declared the variable x to be 21, printed it out, incremented it by 1, and then printed the value out again, you must remember that variables declared within functions do not exist outside of those functions. So when Python runs this piece of Python code, it will not know what variable you are referring. Let's take a look at what happens when we run this piece of Python code. Python gives us an error and lets us know that the variable name that we have specified in our Python code and not in the function has not been defined anywhere it can find in the Python code. Make sure to keep note of what variables are defined where with the indentation of your functions in Python. Similarly, if you declare a variable outside of a function and then try to perform operations on that variable inside of a function, Python will not know what variable you are referencing inside of the function. So let's take a look at what happens when we run this piece of Python code, which does that very thing. Python gives us a specific error and lets us know that the variable we referenced inside of our function has not been declared inside that function. Variables inside of functions are typically referred to as local variables, which is the meaning of this particular error message. That wraps up the basics of using variables and functions within the Python programming language. Make sure to note what indentation you are using when within functions to ensure you don't run into problems when performing actions on variables. In the next lesson, we'll talk about conditional statements and how you can use them in your programs.